Justin Trudeau has continuously shown behaviors that have made persons of repute call out his inactions, and this time it's none other than the Canadian clinical psychologist and professor Jordan Peterson, who has taken it on his capacity to rain criticism on Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister of Canada. Peterson's criticisms usually revolve around Trudeau's devotion to limited ideological values and his imposing of these ideas on the people of Canada. Let's have a closer look.
Maternal love is the love that's going to change the future of mankind. So we'd like you to look
we like to say people kind, not necessarily mankind, because it's more inclusive.
There we go.
Peterson brought up an occasion when Trudeau scolded a lady for using the phrase mankind, advising instead the usage of people kind to be more inclusive. Now, why would the guy do that? In my own opinion, I strongly think that we've got to rely on nature when it comes to how we perceive humans and not based on how we feel.
Our Prime Minister is only capable of running his ideas on a few very narrow ideological tracks. We saw the first evidence of that when he put his cabinet together. He insisted upon making it 50% women, despite the fact that only about 22% of the elected MPs were women.
Peterson went ahead and said that this was a show reflecting Trudeau's inflexible ideological perspective. Justin's choice to guarantee gender balance in his cabinet, despite the smaller proportion of elected female MPs at the time, suggests that he values ideological conformity over ability. Less than 50% won, and you've got the right to say equality needs to be done. I'm not against equality, but the perspective that the Prime Minister exhibits is so alarming and really needs some serious attention.
Well, I actually said that I would refuse to use the pronouns that were mandated by law because they were mandated by law. I feel that it's completely inappropriate of the government to decide what language the citizenry should speak.
Peterson's conflict with Trudeau also relates to more general concerns of gender and language. He most famously challenged the legislative obligation to adopt gender-neutral pronouns, contending that it marks an unheard-of governmental incursion into the domain of human expression. Peterson sees this requirement as an imposition of extreme leftist philosophy, which he thinks is negative for society standards and liberties. It's really simple to see that the Prime Minister is under pressure, but to what end? This guy has always been incredibly biased, taking initiatives that aren't going to benefit Canada at large.
He interjected an ideological statement in the middle of the dialogue, and that indicates, I think, precisely the way he thinks. And I don't think he does think. I think he runs an ideology in his head and accepts the output without question. And I think we're really going to pay for it in Canada in ways that we can't yet imagine.
Peterson went ahead to argue that the attempts to make events and language more inclusive may lead to the repression of conventional standards in the environment, in which even the reference to little girls becomes difficult, given it's a major social error with perhaps dire long-term effects. He's especially worried about the growing acceptability of letting young children pick their gender and enjoy related medical operations.
Yeah, well, it's quite the performance. I mean, I'm afraid that our Prime Minister is only capable of running his ideas on a few very narrow ideological tracks.
Jordan Peterson's attacks on Prime Minister Justin Trudeau center on the enforced ideological conformity, especially in relation to gender and language, and on the wider cultural consequences of these policies. Such changes, he cautions, may undermine conventional cultural standards and liberties, therefore having major effects on society.
Blind, manipulated, led by, I think, our leader, Trudeau. I don't think I've ever heard him say a true word.
However, in a special edition of Off Script, the interviewer asked Dr. Jordan Peterson about the situation of Canadian society, and he presented a scathing criticism of the Prime Minister. Peterson starts by challenging Trudeau's integrity and implying that he's never heard him say anything really honest. Have you noticed that this is a testimony of many critics of the Prime Minister of Canada? He lacks serious integrity. The guy's not really true to what he's saying. This is why people are calling it performative caring.
You know, and I'm not trying to be overly dramatic in that regard. I've met people in my clinical practice and otherwise who were temperamentally incapable of any gesture or any word that was actually genuine. And that's a consequence of long practice. I think he's at least narcissistic.
Peterson contends that Trudeau's actions reflect those of patients that he's seen in his therapeutic work who lack sincerity, and attribute this to long-standing practices fostering similar inclinations. Jordan continues to reiterate that this shows the level of insincerity portrayed by Trudeau. Now, he's lowered himself to nothing and has no reputation, but what I'm sure of is that this guy can't take Canada along with him.
And I think he's enabled by the useful idiots of the Liberal left. And I actually think that's a very widespread problem and probably more typical of Canada now than any other developed country, much to our chagrin.
He considers Trudeau egotistical and suggests that people he refers to as useful idiots of the Liberal left supporting his leadership, therefore addressing a more general concern in Canada than in other affluent countries.
Yeah, that's what he says he's doing. You see, the thing about him and his minions is I don't trust them at all. I think that what Trudeau is doing is testing his fingers in the wind constantly to see where the easiest moral advantage can be obtained and then driving down that direction as fast as he possibly can. I don't believe for a second that he has any such thing as principles. It doesn't look, because I don't think anybody who lies with every single word and gesture ever has principles. And I know, for example,
when considering Canada's past, Peterson points out that it formerly had trustworthy media and institutions. However, he sees this trust as opportunistic and devoid of morality because Trudeau's leadership has 100% degraded it. That is incredibly true because the media has portrayed him in a golden light. Obviously, those were paid to show the press that he's doing great, but the reverse is definitely the case.
This was definitely true during the pandemic. This was true not only of the Liberals, Trudeau's party, but also of the Conservatives and the Socialists, is that during the pandemic, all our politicians did nothing but sample opinion poll constantly, and then derive policy as a consequence of sampling the very people that they frightened with their propagandistic idiocy, and then produce policy.
He attacks the way the COVID-19 epidemic is handled, claiming that Trudeau, among other Canadian politicians, used opinion polls and fear-mongering to influence policy, therefore misrepresenting them as scientifically motivated.
The Chancellor of Germany, who was a socialist, and that's relevant given that hypothetically he's in Trudeau's camp, came to Canada less than a year ago, cap in hand, because the Germans were desperate because they've been following idiot green policies for far too long. And Trudeau said, well, we can't make a business case for shipping you liquid natural gas. Well, and the reason for that is he made it impossible for anybody to make a business case to do that.
Peterson also criticizes Trudeau's environmental policies, especially the direction toward net zero emissions, which he sees as negative for the fossil fuel sector and the Canadian economy. In favor of virtue signaling, Trudeau is accused of discounting economic possibilities, such as possible liquefied natural gas partnerships with Germany and with Japan.
The divine that the state has no right to interfere with in the least. Quite the contrary, must be respectful of continually. And independent of that, I also think that if you're the sort of fool who thinks that the government should have the power to aid people in their own death, well, you've got a lot of thinking to do, buddy, because why would you presume that the government is trustworthy enough to do that?
Peterson also objects to Canada's adoption of assisted dying rules, contending that in a really Christian community, such laws would not exist. He essentially disagrees with the government's participation in assisted death, as it shows a risky excess of governmental authority.
It was quite shocking, everything that happened in that protest, because they seized the bank accounts of 200 Canadians, and that was not amusing. And Trudeau has no idea what that did to Canada's international reputation.
Peterson, in his talk with Bill Mayer on the Club Random podcast, provides a detailed critique of Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's handling of the trucker convoy protests, emphasizing the broader implications for democracy and Canada's internal reputation. The protests, primarily against vaccine mandates and lockdown measures, highlighted significant discontent among various segments of the population. Peterson underscores that protests are a fundamental aspect of a vibrant democracy, serving as a means for citizens to express their objections to governmental policies. In his view, the very essence of protest is to challenge and hold government actions accountable.
Some bank accounts of some people who only sent money to the protest, like through Give, Send, Go, and GoFundMe and so forth.
Oh, I see.
Peterson finds it particularly alarming that Trudeau's government responded to these protests by freezing the bank accounts of those involved. This action wasn't limited to the protesters themselves, but also extended to individuals who merely supported the protests financially through platforms like Give, Send, Go, and GoFundMe. This broad and sweeping measure, Peterson argues, is a severe overreach of governmental power and a troubling precedent. He finds it shocking that such an action could occur in a democratic nation, likening it to measures one might expect in more authoritarian regimes.
Except to object to the policies of the government.
It was quite shocking, everything that happened in that protest, because they seized the bank accounts of 200 Canadians, and that was not amusing. And Trudeau has no idea what that did to Canada's international reputation. That was not a good precedent.
Peterson also highlights the international ramifications of these actions. He asserts that Trudeau needs to understand the damage done to Canada's global reputation. Freezing citizens' bank accounts without due process is seen as a violation of basic rights and freedoms, tarnishing Canada's image as a democratic and just nation. Peterson believes that Canadians have yet to fully grasp the gravity of this situation, partly due to a lack of awareness about the international consequences.
In fact, one of the banks actually apologized. There's 5 big banks in Canada, and one of them actually apologized for doing it eventually. They all should have apologized, but one did. Yeah, it was really bad. It was shocking. Canadians aren't sufficiently shocked about it.
One of the major banks of Canada eventually issued an apology for participating in the financial freezing, a move that Peterson views as an acknowledgement of the inappropriateness of the action. However, he argues that all the banks involved should have issued apologies, given the severity of the impact on individuals' lives.
First of all, it was the Russians. It's like, oh yes, that's the Russians' primary concern. And then it was like literally MAGA Republican Americans funding the trucker protests in Ottawa. It was so
and
ridiculous.
they were protesting vaccine mandates?
Yeah, essentially. But they were protesting the lockdowns more broadly, I would say. Yeah. And because it was really hard on them. It was hard, obviously. You were locked down. You know how fun that was.
Peterson is also critical of the misinformation spread by Trudeau regarding the funding of the protests. Trudeau claimed that the trucker convoy was financed by Republican Americans and possibly influenced by Russians. Peterson dismisses these claims as absurd, noting that there's no logical reason for American Republicans or Russians to be involved in fomenting dissent in Ottawa. Such accusations, he argues, were baseless and served only to divert attention from the legitimate grievances of the protesters. It's pretty obvious to see that Trudeau's no good for Canada. You can see this track record of spending a lot, going on vacation, and enjoying life on taxpayer dollars. This is just uncalled for, and his critics are well deserving to call him out for it.